Five Nights at Freddy's is a dark take on children's entertainment restaurants with animatronic mascots. Bendy and the Ink Machine is a haunted revision of classic 30s cartoons. Poppy Playtime adopts a similar, twisted children's content aesthetic. Don't Hug Me, I'm Scared's whole premise is that of an educational children's television show gone very, very wrong. Choo-Choo Charlie is an upcoming indie title in which you're stalked by an evil man-eating version of Thomas the Tank Engine or something. Wait, what? Whoa, dude. So what genre are the classic FNAF games? Analog horror. How about Security Breach? Analog horror. How about Poppy Playtime? Analog horror. What about the YouTube web series Local 58? Also, analog horror. The Mandela Catalogue? Analog horror. In the last few years, we've seen the twisted children's content aesthetic grow very popular. While it's nothing new, this type of horror has seen a huge surge in popularity in the last decade, and especially in the last couple of years. There's definitely a lot of crossover between this sort of nostalgic horror and the analog horror genre that's become so popular as of late. However, they're not always the same thing. I wouldn't call projects like Bendy and the Ink Machine analog horror. Bendy is centered around a fictional television series created long before the VHS tape. It's all ink and film. That might technically count as analog, but I think we can all agree that Bendy's aesthetic is not what one thinks of when generalizing the analog horror aesthetic. Regardless, it's undeniable that a game like Bendy appeals to a lot of the same people that enjoy games like Five Nights at Freddy's and Poppy Playtime. Games that certainly do utilize the analog horror tropes. No, even before the analog horror aspect, there's something about the vibe of these games that feels similar despite all of them having their own distinct designs, visuals, and mechanics. This twisted nostalgia subgenre was popularized by now classic analog tropes like fuzzy, low-resolution video, and tinny audio. While a lot of analog horror content uses distortion to disguise lower fidelity assets, today's sponsor, Raid Shadow Legends, does not. Raid is a mobile game with crisp, console-level fidelity. Forget everything you know about mobile games. Raid Shadow Legends was designed with core gamers in mind. It features a comprehensive roster of over 600 champions. Wait, 600 champions? I thought the roster of Ultimate Custom Night was big. That's nothing compared to this. In addition to competitive PvP, Raid features a robust PvE campaign that is absolutely stuffed with content. Recently, the Hydra boss was added to Raid's already huge roster of bosses. As a lifelong gamer, I've fought many a Hydra in my day, and I was curious to see what was in store. That's a nice looking Hydra, but only one head? What kind of Hydra only has one head? Those are a lot of heads. Still, I've got 6 dudes, it's no problem. I've got 5 dudes, it's no problem. This guy kind of has it rough. Everyone else is like hurling magic projectiles, whereas this dude needs to run all the way over, brave death, all to get one swing in. Should've learned magic, yo. And the Hydra just devoured them. At least I still have 4 dudes. Great. Well, I still have the healer. As long as you have a healer, you can come back from anything. Oh, the Hydra ate my healer. Each of the heads have unique abilities and mechanics. If you manage to take out one of the heads, you can deal some serious damage, but it will grow back eventually. I love a traditional RPG, but I can't devote as much time to them as I used to. I love how Raid adapts traditional gameplay we're familiar with into a format that can be played on my phone while I'm waiting for the subway. There's never been a better time to dive into Raid Shadow Legends. Click the link in the description or scan this QR code to receive unique rewards worth $30, a free champion, hundreds of thousands of silver, energy refills, XP boosts. If you've ever been interested in Raid, this offer seems like a no-brainer. Thanks so much to Raid Shadow Legends for sponsoring this video. A lot of the major entries in the genre have moved away from the analog side of analog horror. Sure, Poppy Playtime shows some static when you die, and you collect VHSs and place them into VCRs, but nothing else about the game's aesthetic really makes me think of VHS era. The whole factory is really futuristic looking, and the game's visuals are pretty sharp. It's the opposite of most analog horror. Poppy Playtime may pay homage to the analog horror titles that predated it, but ultimately it ended up with an aesthetic that really isn't reminiscent of those games. Security Breach feels similar. While analog effects show up during certain events and when looking through video cameras, the game itself is sharp and futuristic. It's certainly not set in the analog era. Five Nights at Freddy's Security Breach and Poppy Playtime are aesthetically similar though. Sure, they both pay light homage to the analog horror tropes, but beyond that, both games are really colorful, surreal feeling experiences, set in unrealistic fantasy locations. One would think juxtaposing a colorful, kid-friendly aesthetic with the dark, sinister underbellies of these games is what enables them to feel like analog horror series in the first place. I certainly felt that way myself, and I didn't really think about it again until somewhat recently, when I was made aware of Choo-Choo Charles. Choo-Choo Charles is an upcoming indie survival horror game where you're stalked by a horrifying spider train. It looks pretty rad. But more interestingly, it appears to adhere to the same trends as the aforementioned indie horror titles. Choo-Choo Charles is a really clean, sharp-looking game. However, unlike Security Breach and Poppy Playtime, Choo-Choo Charles uses a much more muted, realistic, subdued color palette. It definitely doesn't evoke analog horror vibes, and I think that's really interesting, because Thomas the Tank Engine may as well already count as analog horror. Check out this video from Tom Scott and friends for more details on why Thomas is so much darker than one might expect. Yeah, the developer of Choo-Choo Charles is very careful to never mention the T word when discussing their game, but it's presumably somewhat inspired by Thomas. Thus, I would have expected it to adopt a more traditional analog horror aesthetic. Surprisingly, it doesn't, and I think that's really rad. I like analog horror, don't get me wrong, but it's refreshing to see that these more high-tech adaptations are gaining popularity as well. Indie horror titles have been incredibly successful in the last decade, and I believe a lot of the analog horror aesthetics that became popular at the same time were really a product of necessity. As technology improves, the visual fidelity of games becomes better, but these higher resolutions also make producing a scary game a lot more difficult. By adopting the VHS aesthetic and making everything fuzzy, smaller teams were able to use lower fidelity assets much more effectively. Scott Cawthon, developer of Five Nights at Freddy's, famously created the first game while working at Dollar General. He modeled some of the characters on a laptop during a car ride. This is what indie development is. One doesn't have Pixar on call to sculpt models. When a single person is responsible for designing, programming, and creating all the assets for a game, the analog horror aesthetic was a huge time saver. Assets could be constructed without nearly as much detail, as they would usually be obscured by static, distortion, or darkness. With the arrival of these sleeker, sharper indie horror titles, I'm not really sure what we call them. Of course, when I see a game like Choo-Choo Charles, I immediately think about Thomas the Tank Engine growing spider legs and going on a bloodthirsty rampage, and that's hilariously creepy. I grew up in the 90s, and while technology was beginning to get really good, I still watched reruns of older kids shows on my CRT television. I remember always being able to tell that shows like Thomas the Tank Engine or Eureka's Castle were old, whereas shows like Blue's Clues were new. I didn't realize it at the time, but the thing all the shows I deemed old had in common was the way they were shot, on film cameras. Eureka's Castle was just a puppet show they filmed. Thomas the Tank Engine used model train tracks and animatronic trains. These characters were simply puppeteered by someone whilst a film camera captured it. When we look back on it today, something about the way those shows blended real-life footage with fantasy scenarios is just unnerving. Unlike an animated cartoon, these shows were shot with television cameras. Even as a kid, I could tell they were shot in real life, and somehow they were able to get these characters to move around and act plausibly lifelike. At the time, it was an affordable way to produce children's content, but in hindsight, something about it is just so creepy. It's the same kind of creepiness evoked by Battington's terrifying FNAF videos. That same uncanny creepiness pulses through the aesthetic of games like FNAF and Choo-Choo Charles, despite them both being really silly and ridiculous on a conceptual level. Haunted animatronics at a pizza place, a man-eating spider train, these are really strong concepts, and while they're ludicrous, there's still this uncanny weirdness running through them. Something about them is still spooky, no matter how high concept things may get. Another really spooky thing is that you probably aren't subscribed. If you aren't, please consider subscribing if you want to. Until now, I chalked this unnerving feeling up to the analog horror aesthetic, a perversion of my memories growing up in the VHS era. However, the trend is moving away from the analog stuff whilst maintaining the high concept, twisted nostalgia aesthetic. Security Breach has begun to de-emphasize the analog horror aspects of the FNAF series, and it's the most successful entry to date. The trailer for Poppy Playtime Chapter 2 recently released, and it looks pretty slick despite a much more dilapidated setting than that of Chapter 1. Choo-Choo Charles, while stylized, goes for a much more muted, sharp, realistic aesthetic, to the point that I don't think it could be rightfully classified as analog horror in the first place. I think it goes without saying that there's something that binds together a lot of the recent indie horror trends, but it's clear to me that analog horror isn't it. Analog horror is no longer a satisfactory umbrella term for this subgenre. If you take out all the VHS distortion and static screens from games like Poppy Playtime and Security Breach, you're still left with two aesthetically similar games, and ones that have a very high likelihood of appealing to the same types of gamers. I would argue that Choo-Choo Charles falls into the same aesthetic too. It's not analog horror, but rather twisted nostalgia or something like that. So what is this twisted nostalgia moniker I'm proposing? Well, I guess it would encompass anything that distorts a concept that we associate with family-friendly content. Five Nights at Freddy's plays with the uncanny weirdness of family restaurants with animatronic mascots, as well as the nefarious corporate underbelly of the associated company. Bendy and the Ink Machine takes the kid-friendly, though already dark, Max Fleischer cartoons and twists them into a bizarre Lovecraftian tale. Choo-Choo Charles distorts the weird premise of inanimate objects that are somehow alive, with the natural comparison being the already creepy Thomas the Tank Engine. I don't think it's very meaningful to lump a bunch of games together simply because they have VHS era aesthetics to them. On the flip side, I also think it's dumb to segregate really similar games all based on the presence of some fuzzy visuals or a VCR somewhere. It goes beyond games, sure. The trendy indie horror series on YouTube happen to be analog horror right now. But what happens when inevitably someone creates a series akin to the Mandela Catalogue or the Monument Mythos, but it doesn't use analog aesthetics? Surely such a work should have some kind of association with each other. They're similar content, no? We call these series analog horror, but they're really found footage series. It just so happens that tapes are the only plausible medium for a stack of old video footage. Add in the budgetary advances of utilizing analog horror aesthetics in a production, and it's no surprise that these series are predominantly analog horror. There does appear to be a lot of crossover between twisted nostalgia and analog horror. Local 58 has moments of children's television programming that would feel right at home in a FNAF or Poppy-style game. The Monument Mythos utilizes children's drawings throughout. The Mandela Catalogue frequently utilizes old Bible cartoons in its storytelling. These are predominantly found footage analog horror series, yet all of them contain elements of the twisted nostalgia popularized by games like FNAF. I suspect it's a natural consequence of making a creepy analog horror series. Most of the people producing this kind of content were rather young during the VHS era, and thus they associate the analog aesthetic with childhood. I know I do. It's inherently nostalgic for me when I encounter something like the analog effect present in Security Breach. It makes a lot of sense that creators utilizing analog horror often throw in some bits of twisted nostalgia. The two just work really well together. However, it doesn't feel fair to bundle all these different works together as analog horror. While there's a lot of crossover between respective fandoms, I don't think that most of us would consider Poppy Playtime to be particularly similar to Kane Pixel's Backrooms series. I know I sure don't. I doubt most people would even consider them to be in the same genre. Their only real association is the analog horror moniker.
Wait, wow, why are you still talking to me, Scott?
If the only thing two analog horror series have in common is the fact that they use VCRs and analog distortion and stuff, then what's the point of this analog horror association in the first place? I believe that analog horror has become an umbrella term for two distinct types of content, both of which deserve their own, more granular classification. On one hand, we have the twisted nostalgia concept I discussed before. Series like FNAF, Choo-Choo Charles, Poppy Playtime, and Candle Cove. These often do adopt a VHS era aesthetic, but I believe that's just a consequence of the typical 30-year-old game developer having grown up in that era. If one pulls from their childhood memories in order to evoke fear and make something scary, and they grew up in the era of analog television, it's pretty likely that their game is going to end up with an analog aesthetic. On the flip side, if you're a younger developer who doesn't have as much nostalgia for the VHS era, your take on twisted nostalgia might not have any analog horror elements. Or it might. Alex Kister, creator of the Mandela Catalogue, is a young person who couldn't have had much nostalgia for that era, yet they still managed to produce one of the most popular analog horror series today. I grew up in the 90s, and I think analog horror is a really cool aesthetic. That said, I also think it's a pretty pitiful label for a genre of game or film. We have classic FNAF, we have Security Breach, we have Poppy Playtime, the Mandela Catalogue, the Monument Mythos, early Slender Man mythos. All of these series are really unique, and while they share similarities, it just seems wrong for us to group them all into a single category simply because there's some static here and there. Analog horror is an aesthetic, a technique used by many radically different titles. It isn't a genre. Classic Five Nights at Freddy's is a survival horror game. It's ultimately about resource management, not terribly dissimilar from Resident Evil. Poppy Playtime is a short, mediocre puzzle game in a spooky haunted house. Local 58 is like a modern Lovecraftian apocalyptic science fiction horror story. Choo-Choo Charles is still in development, but it appears to be an open-world survival horror exploration game. There's a large map, consumable resources to collect, missions, and first-person combat. The Mandela Catalogue is a paranormal sci-fi horror story with religious themes. To me, it feels more like a modern take on the genre popularized by The Exorcist than anything else. Those are genres, and those are the kinds of qualities by which we should be associating content. What's interesting is that when we ignore the analog horror elements and simply focus on the core themes and gameplay presented by each game, there are still clearly thematic similarities between games like FNAF, Poppy Playtime, Choo-Choo Charles, and many others. While these games are all fundamentally different, they all evoke that feeling of twisted nostalgia. They all take a concept that we associate with childhood, innocence, and security, and they contort it into something horrifying. For some reason, in 2022, we find this type of horror really effective. Something about turning any type of children's content into a horror story is just fundamentally disturbing to us. I'm not a psychologist, so my guess is as good as yours. Why do you think content that distorts family-friendly themes into something dark is so effective at scaring us? What would you call this phenomenon? Twisted nostalgia was the best I could come up with, but there are other proposed labels out there. Let me know what term you think best describes this type of content. Thanks for watching, and thanks again to Raid for sponsoring this video. Also, I recently chatted with a couple of my FNAF friends on the Dark Rooms podcast. Check it out if you're interested.